Are you someone who deals with tight hips, or you feel like your glutes, your quads, and just the musculature around your hips just can't let go? Well, if that's speaking to you, then this video will be for you. Throughout the course of this video, you are going to learn some of the underlying reasons and mechanisms behind why the muscles, in particular around the hips and the pelvic floor, tend to get so bound up to begin with. We're also going to go over some corrective exercises that will hopefully promote some length and stability, coupled with some strength around the hips, and hopefully leave you with a better understanding of what it is that you can do with this underlying tightness around your hips. So without further ado, let's jump straight into it. So there is a myriad of reasons as to why people get tight hips, but what I'm going to share with you today is some of the most common themes that I typically see with clients, as well as someone who had extremely rigid hips. You could literally put your index fingers on my TFL and I'd be screaming in agony. So coming from someone who had very rigid hips and who can now move them somewhat decently, I'm going to share some of my personal experience as well as what I have found has worked best for clients. So one of the primary reasons as to why you might be dealing with this chronic feeling of tightness around your hips is just because the muscles themselves aren't going through a full range of motion or really moving at all. This was the camp that I was in. I didn't really allow my hips to properly rotate or shift in movement. It wasn't really anything that I was really ever taught to do. And what ended up happening is these muscles around my hips just ended up getting super locked down just from lack of motion. So one thing that we're going to be going through once we get into the exercise portion is actually getting used to things like hip rotation. Because as we start to go through the movement or function of hip rotation, it's actually elongating or lengthening a lot of these muscles that tend to be really locked down. So first and foremost, one reason why you might be getting this sense of tightness is just due to the joint not moving through its full range of motion. Another common reason is actually the counter to that. So instead of it being too rigid, there's actually too much laxity in the hips. And how this will typically present itself is with kind of this excessive shifting through the hips when you go through something like walking. And what this typically tells me is that the joint is going through too much of a range of motion relative to the muscular and connective tissue capacity of the hips. And what ends up happening as a byproduct of that, if I keep going into these excessive ranges of motion, typically the smaller muscles end up locking down as a means to protect the joint from getting injured or your body from getting injured. And that is typically when you experience that sense of tightness. So one thing that we'll want to do in order to counter this is we'll actually want to kind of tighten things up a little bit so that we're not going through as big of a range of motion and start to reorient where tension is. If these smaller muscles are having to overwork, then chances are that the bigger muscles are probably underworking. And big muscles are big for a reason. So what we're going to try to do is access those bigger muscles, try to redistribute or reorient tension into those muscles so that the smaller muscles can work as they should, more as supplementary or accessory to the bigger muscles, and hopefully get out of that feeling of being locked down. So with some of the theory out of the way, let's get into some of those exercises to better stabilize and integrate your hips into your movement. So for our first exercise, you can grab a soccer ball or something of similar size. Ideally, it has a little bit of give to it. This ball is relatively flat-ish, so there is going to be some give because we do want to have something we can squeeze against. You'll take the tool of your choice, and I'm just going to use sticks here, but you can certainly go up to a countertop or anything that you can kind of rest your arms on. So grab the tool of your choice. You're going to take that in between your legs. And what we're going to start to work on is the principles of getting some hip rotation. So I'm going to turn to the side here. Again, you can imagine that I just have my arms on a countertop or something at about this height. And what we're going to start to sit back into is a hinging motion of our pelvis. So I'm going to sit back and I'm going to try to sense that my hamstrings are getting a little bit of a stretch in that position. Keeping this squeeze against the tool of your choice in an attempt to hopefully get these inner thigh muscles a little bit active. And what we're going to start to work on here is we're going to start to go through a hip rotation. So my right hip is gonna start to go back, and you can see my left knee came forward as that happened. I feel a little bit of weight come into my right heel as I'm in that hip rotation to the right. And then keeping the squeeze on the ball, I'm just gonna rotate back the other way. Now weight is more on my left foot and my left heel. And what we're trying to sense as you're going through this is more or less an exchange of length, tension through the hamstring and glute on each side. So I'm just going from right to left, being mindful that as you're going through that, you're not doing something like this, where you're starting to go into a shift. Because what you'll notice as you start to go through these rotations with the pelvis is your body is going to try to accommodate around the default pattern that you have given it. So if you're someone who shifts the pelvis a lot, when you go through that rotation, you may find that you're actually just shifting the opposing way. So be mindful that your rotations are somewhat clean, is how I would describe them. And you're kind of working more on this linear path from side to side. I'd work through about 8 to 10 rotations each way and take your time going through that motion, spending about 3 to 4 seconds on each side, really trying to feel that transfer of weight and tension from side to side. For this next exercise, we're going to be working through the exact same hip rotation that we were just doing with the ball, but we're going to start to add a rhythm and a little bit more of a dynamic nature to it. So I'm going to be using a kettlebell. If you don't have one, you can use a dumbbell. You can also use a water bottle. That works here as well. Anything that you can swing that's going to create some momentum, that will work here. So grabbing the tool of your choice, we're going to come into that same stance. And what I want you to try to feel here is that exact feedback that you were just creating in the previous exercise. So imagine you have that ball between your legs. You kind of feel supported through your feet. And we're going to start to work through a dynamic hinge around this rhythm. So I'm going to be swinging back, and we're just going to work the one side for now. So in this case, it's going to be my right side. And what I want you to try to sense is that as the dumbbell, or kettlebell in this case, sorry, is going back, you're finding that heel pressure on your right side coupled with that hip rotation. I'd go through about 12 to 14 reps on that one side, trying to keep weight on that right side. So I'm feeling that right leg is now starting to work as I'm taking my hip through that dynamic range. Once I get my 10, then I'm gonna switch. And again, I'm trying to add that motion with the knees. So as I'm sitting back into this left hip, my right knee is shifting forward ever so slightly, and that's helping me to find a little bit more of that range in that hip. I'm gonna find that left heel, and as I'm standing up, I'm just letting my hamstring and glute kind of work as I'm going through that motion. My upper body is staying relatively relaxed, and just be mindful that when you're going through the swing, your upper body isn't collapsing here, where we're getting this rounding motion. You do want to try to keep some integrity through your upper body as to allow the hips themselves to be the primary driver to that movement. The more you can start to work on this dynamically with that rhythm, the more you're going to notice when you start to move around that hip rotation becomes a little bit more intuitive. Unless you teach your body it in a conscious way, it's going to be really difficult to start to adapt that unconsciously. So get the reps in, and you'll start to notice that hip rotation comes a little bit more intuitively. And as a byproduct, you're going to be using those bigger muscle groups to support the hips. And over time, those smaller muscles will start to offload with tension and also get adequate length in the process. Anyways, that is going to wrap it for this week's video on your tight hips. I hope you learned a few new things as to the underlying reasons as to why that may be presenting itself in the way that it is, and you feel a little bit better equipped to take on some of that tightness that you may be experiencing. If you found this video helpful, then you can consider subscribing for more content like it, and you can also go watch a video right here that the YouTube algorithm thinks you'll enjoy. I'll see you there.